Hi, my name's Vince Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about Jimmy Savile, a British horror story, which is a new documentary, two-part documentary on Netflix. Jimmy Savile, of course, was a national treasure who was then disgraced after his death when countless revelations of sexual abuse surfaced against him, particularly from young girls, but also from some boys as well as the elderly, even rumours of dead people he interfered with. If there's anyone who ever went from hero to zero in such a quick way in the British consciousness, it was Jimmy Savile. Now, being British and being of a particular age where I grew up, with Jimmy Savile always being on the TV, this two-part documentary is perhaps nothing new. And although if you don't know about him and you're watching from the States or another country, then this would be truly shocking. I do think, though, this is the best documentary I've seen on Jimmy Savile in terms of the way it's edited and in terms of getting the idea across of how familiar this figure was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, to a lesser extent the 90s and 2000s in Great Britain, and also just the sheer horror at the crimes he committed. The documentary's in two parts, two episodes. The first one really builds up this picture of Jimmy Savile as a national treasure. Jimmy Savile became famous through being a DJ on the radio, Radio 1, and then was one of the few disc jockeys who could translate to television, and he became a presenter of Top of the Pops. And with his eccentric mannerisms, his kind of bleached hair, his jewellery, his cigar, his eccentric clothes, his vocal mannerisms, now then, all this kind of thing. He became somewhat of a star, and he mixed with the rich and the famous. Elvis Presley, there's pictures of him with him, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and eventually even going as far as Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, and the royal family. Jimmy Savile seemed to have an ease and a charm with everyone he met, certainly in the public sphere. We'll find out more about his private dealings in the second episode. But this first episode really paints this picture as someone who is much beloved by the nation, a great British eccentric. And his fame was elevated even further in the 1980s with this show called Jim Will Fix It, which I remember watching as a kid, where children could write in and ask for their dreams, their wishes to be granted. So he was like this kind of Father Christmas figure, and he'd have this big armchair and he'd pull out a Jim Will Fix It badge and put it on the children's necks after they'd done something they'd always wanted to do. Jump through a hoop of fire on a motorbike, or visit a Hollywood film studio, or fly on Concorde, or whatever it might be. That's how I remember him primarily, as someone in their mid-40s now. But he was also much loved because of his charity work. He raised millions in the course of his lifetime through running marathons, all in the aid largely for hospitals, particularly Stoke Mandeville Hospital, which is a hospital in, I think it's Buckinghamshire, which helps disabled people. And he raised like £10 million, I think it was, for a new spinal injuries unit there. And of course, politicians fawned over him, the royal family did. They saw him as having some kind of knack with the ordinary people of the country. They asked for his advice, according to this documentary, particularly Prince Charles. So Jimmy Savile's influence ranged the length and breadth of the UK, quite literally, because he was travelling all the time in his kind of motor van. But of course also he seemed to touch people's hearts. Now personally I always found him incredibly creepy, even as a kid, watching him on TV. And countless other people did as well. And you know, there were always jokes and rumours about Jimmy Savile, which at the time some people thought would be unkind because he was just an eccentric guy, clearly a bit odd, but he did so much good for people. So any rumours that were there, you know, were just seen as kind of spiteful things to say about a great but undeniably weird British figure. So episode 1 paints this picture of this legend, this British legend. And actually, even someone who knows about the depth, the depravity of his crimes, watching him in this first episode, particularly the charity work, in a weird way you start to warm to him again. I mean, there's a real power to this person, even years after his death, I think. Anyway, we then move on to episode 2. And this is where we find out about the dark side of Jimmy Savile. It's here that the magnitude of his crimes are revealed. And it's in this episode that there's a series of probing interviews with him via the press and on TV, which seem to press at those uncomfortable sides to his character, about the fact that he never seemed to have any close relationships, about the fact that he was always on the move, about the fact that why did he devote so much time volunteering for work at Leeds General Infirmary, why he seemed to surround himself with young women, you know, some seemingly very young. And this shows how incredibly intelligent Jimmy Savile was. The way he deals with these questions, he creates this smoke screen around him, and he almost admits to crimes in a very jocular, jovial way, which seems to disarm everybody. There's certainly an element of hiding in plain sight with Jimmy Savile, and there's this frightening intelligence which enabled him to pull the wool over a whole nation's eyes. You could argue elements, you know, even further afield. I mean, he met the Pope once. So from seeing these interviews, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see how manipulative he was, how scheming he was. You can see in his eyes a sense of gloating over this, even in these interviews. And it's here that is revealed that after he died, despite some accusations a couple of years before his death, which was kind of dealt incompetently by the Surrey police and with the help of a top lawyer, George Carman, QC, it seems that it's only after Jimmy Savile's death that these revelations came to light. The BBC quashed a programme exposing him just after his death, which is a big stain on that media outlet, which, remember, employed him for all these years, and Savile abused people on their premises. But then when these crimes come out and the survivors come forward, you see how depraved and what a monster this person was, abusing young girls, in particular in church, in a private girls' school for young offenders, in the hospitals he worked in, including paralysed children, his travels up and down the country in his motor home, his various pads around the country. The guy seemed to just have this double life, which you got hints of occasionally in his public persona, where the rumours came from, the jokes came from, his hiding in plain sight, his knowing jokes about his court case next Thursday, for instance, which crops up all the time. But then you realise that there is this really dark, evil side to this man's character, who just abused whenever he could, stretching back to at least 1955. And he kind of groomed a whole nation. Everybody just fell under his spell, it seems. Everyone had the wool pulled over their eyes. From the ordinary person working in a fish and chip shop in the high street in the north of England, to the Queen, to the Prime Minister, even the Pope. This guy seemed to cast a spell, and that enabled him to get away with unspeakable crimes against hundreds of people, particularly young girls. You know, thus the title of this documentary, A British Horror Story, is certainly apt. So, despite seeing similar documentaries before, despite reading about Jimmy Savile, I found this an extremely interesting and frightening documentary, which should serve as a cautionary tale for how we view people in the public eye and the lionisation of celebrities. And my goodness me, we certainly put particular people on the pedestal today, don't we? And we need to be really careful who we are putting on a pedestal. Let's take some lessons from the case of Jimmy Savile and his duping of Great Britain. Just as another note, I found it incredibly interesting about how Jimmy Savile viewed religion. Being a Catholic, he was devout, but he seemed to see his faith in a very transactional way. What do I mean by that? Well, he kind of figured in his head that if he did so much work for charity, that would kind of get him off the hook for his sexual misdemeanours, you know, his paedophilia, his sexual abuse, which he hinted at interviews as well. So, a deeply worrying theology. He seemed to have this kind of imaginary ledger book, you know, which would help him on the Day of Judgment. And finally, check out the trailer to this documentary series. I think it's one of the best trailers I've ever seen. I watched it after I watched the whole thing. It's so well edited. You know, congratulations to whoever put that together, because it's a really fantastic piece of television in its own right. Thanks for watching. I just got a brief presentation with the main themes which sprung up from this documentary. Bye.